There's no other choice. It's the only way we survive.
No, no.
We divide the rations among us, and keep the seeds for spring.
Marta cut the loaf with one slow motion, and a man in the queue hissed when his portion came away thinner than a thumb. Suspicion tightened her hands as she saw fingers count the crumbs before anyone could step forward. Voices clustered at the bakery door. A child reached for a slice and pulled back when an older woman folded her hands as if to measure distance. The immediate problem was clear. The village had nearly no flour left, and every small piece mattered. Marta had baked since dawn. She smelled yeast and smoke in her hair. She worked the dough with the same steady rhythm she used when the mill still turned full, and the summer had not been thin. She kept her eyes on the line. Villagers did not push. They did not shout, but suspicion passed from one face to the next, and Marta felt it like grit under her nails. That suspicion shaped her choice. She would divide the loaf in public, where everyone could see the measure and no one could claim a hidden portion. A man in the queue spoke first. "Marta," he said, "my wife is cold. She needs more." The line shuddered. Hands gripped the basket handles. Marta nodded once and cut another sliver. "Not more, Thomas," she said quietly. "We share what we have now, not later." Thomas touched the cloth over his basket as if to hide the hollow inside. The narrator's voice, measured and patient, kept attention on concrete details. The longhouse bell had not sounded. The mill wheel outside had slowed through the week. Ansel had been to the stores that evening. Marta did not yet know what he had found. She only knew the loaf felt lighter than it should. She knew the queue had eyes that darted to pockets and to doorways. Ansel came into the bakery after she had finished handing out slices. He carried his ledger in a leather satchel, and the satchel left a damp ring on the floor. He smelled of grain dust and cold stone. He set the satchel on the counter and made no greeting. "Marta," he said, "the mill sacks are wet." The top sacks were cut open. He put a finger on the ledger and tapped a line as if to make the ledger speak. Doubt entered the room with him. Marta paused in her warm apron. The villagers at the door straightened like a cord being pulled. Ansel opened his hand and let a few dull kernels fall into his palm. He let them run between his fingers. Weevils. Rot. Someone's cut seams. He did not name a suspect. The sentence itself pushed distrust into the queue. A woman near the door whispered, "Who would do that?" Another voice answered, "Who would hide what we need?" Marta wiped flour from her cheek and said nothing, but she folded the cloth of her apron into the palm of her hand. Her hands moved as they always did when she decided. Tight, practical motions. She stepped toward the mill ledger and scanned entries Ansel had kept for years. Ansel read aloud a line of numbers. "Late harvest, 2 sacks down," he said. "Last month's tally shows 5 measures recorded, but the store only holds 3. He tapped a second column. "There's an erased line here, near the bottom." His voice remained soft, but his jaw set. The villagers leaned in. Frustration broke in. "Ansel," one man called. "Who erased it?" Another demanded. "Show us." Ansel looked up and met Marta's eyes. Marta felt a shift from suspicion to a tight, practical urgency. She understood that counting alone would not feed anyone. She thought of the oven's heat and how, that morning, she had saved a crust for an old neighbor. That choice now mattered. The scene moved to the mill that night. Ansel worked the lantern with both hands to keep the flame steady. He moved sacks and felt seams with the pad of his thumb. Damp grain gave under his touch, and the first full emotion change found voice as cold anger in his fingers. He allowed, "Someone opened these sacks after I sealed them." He did not yet accuse a name. His accusation found shape in the ledger's erased line. At the longhouse that night, the council gathered. People came with their shawls and with the small things they hoped to trade. A tin spoon, a silver button, a child's cap. Marta arrived and put her wool apron on the bench. She kept moving. The narrator noted the way she kept her shoulders forward, like a woman who held the heat of an oven inside her torso. Ansel set the ledger on the table with a small thump. The longhouse fell into an ordered silence. He read numbers aloud, and the villagers reacted with short phrases. "Impossible, not enough, what will we do?" Marta stood and said, "We pool what remains and bake one loaf at a time. Timed shares. One measured slice per door." Her voice had the weight of a person who had practiced compromise, and who knew how to slice bread so it fed more of them. A man named Joran objected. "Ansel, you count us like cattle. If my family needs more, what then?" Ansel replied, "Joran, the ledger does not count once. It counts what we possess." The exchange lasted 3 short lines. The rhythm of the argument tightened the meeting. Marta did not argue with Joran. She watched him, then folded her hands and proposed a specific measure. Each household would have a fixed time to receive its slice and a second allotment for nursing children. Her plan put procedure ahead of accusation. Outside the longhouse, in the doorway that led toward the ovens, a woman named Edda approached Marta with a small, battered locket in her palm. She had walked with snow still clinging to her hem. She pressed the locket into Marta's fingers without meeting her eyes. "Please, Edda, 1 pinch of meal." For the boy, Marta felt the shift in the room from measured sharing to personal pleading. Neighbors watched through the doorway. Some hands went to mouths to hide the look of hunger on their faces. Marta accepted the locket and tucked it into her apron pouch. She kept the locket out of sight. She did not count the action as theft. She felt a new emotion rise. Compassion overriding the strict measures she had proposed. Marta's fingers trembled when she closed her hand around the locket, then stopped trembling when she steadied her breath. She promised 1 small pinch. She did not tell Edda of Ansel's ledger or of the erased tolly. She had thought she could keep this quiet and safe. Ansel kept counting. He went back to the mill and sat by the ledger in lamplight, running a finger down a column until he found a faint, recent scrape where numbers had been rubbed away and replaced. He found a second, hidden column folded under the paper, tied with a thread that matched the color of a widow's shawl. Ansel felt suspicion curdle into a hot, sharp certainty. He whispered, "Who kept these extra lines?" and his tone invited accusation. The next hour brought discovery. Ansel and Marta together went to the abandoned granary behind the mill. The narrator recorded their steps. Marta's wool apron brushing the cold boards, Ansel's fingers testing the loose floorboard. They worked without speaking the names of possible suspects. Ansel pried at the board and felt a hollow beneath. Marta crouched and put her hand into the gap and found a small shawl tucked inside. A muffled breath came from under the cloth. The 2 adults exchanged a single look that carried a quick rotation in feeling, suspicion splicing into urgent compassion. The lid came away and a child blinked up at them. The child's cheeks were hollow, but the eyes were open. There was the smell of stale grain mixed with the scent of the shawl. Marta lifted the shawl with one hand and the child's spine, and the boy turned toward the lamplight with a small, raw sound. Ansel's mouth tightened. He who hid them, and the question flew outward like a thrown stone. The revelation widened the scene. They found not only the child, but a small cache of meal baked into cloth sacks and a scrap of a note. The note did not name names. It listed a string of small transfers and a scrap of a family name. The ledger's erased line now had a possible explanation. A neighbor had taken from stores and funneled the grain to a family in secret. When they carried the child back across the yard, villagers gathered at the granary gate with quick, short lines of speech. "Why hide a child?" Asked Thomas, who stole the grain. Asked Joran. The conversation broke into a rapid exchange of 3 to 6 short lines. Joran insisted on punishment. Marta, not punishment, explanation. "We have to know why." Her voice steadied the crowd. Ansel read the scrap of note aloud. The name on the note belonged to an elder, Narvik, a man known for his slow steps and generous hand in better years. Accusation came like a second wind. Narvik hoarded. Someone cried Narvik was beloved. His wife had died in the last spring. The villagers circled the elder's small cottage and stood with questions on their lips. When they confronted Narvik, he did not deny the stores. He explained with a voice thin from cold, "I gave it to my sister's children. She could not keep them and there was no one else." His explanation carried a precise detail: the sister's last name, the kinship tie, the rote through which bread had been moved. The villagers' anger bent and split into another set of emotions: judgment, empathy, and the practical reckoning of how they would feed more mouths. Marta spoke in the center of the ring. "Ansel," she said, "we must change the ledger and share by timed measure now, and we must name who receives what." The decision landed as an action. Ansel set his jaw, moved the ledger to his lap, and began to write a new column. He showed villagers how the new system would work. A visible mark for each household, a time of day for collection, and a public weighing of loaves. His care in the counting turned suspicion into a structured plan. There was pushback. Joran demanded immediate exile for anyone who falsified counts, tumas for exceptions for nursing mothers. The argument tightened into 4 rapid exchanges. Voices rose and then calmed under Marta's steady interjections. The scene turned into a negotiation where Marta's tactile gestures, kneading the air, pointing at the ledger, drawing a chalk line on the floor, acted as the language of compromise. That shift from argument to policy showed how the village moved from accusation to communal procedure. At midday, Ansel reopened the mill and presented the ledger to anyone who would look. He protested a small, stubborn fact. The grain found in the cache would not have fed a large family for long. The hidden supply had been modest. Narvik's explanation held together because the note matched small transfers to a single household. The villagers argued in short bursts. Marta kept passing small bowls of hot broth to those nearest the fire. Her motion of handing bowls became a public statement of how she would practice compassion. In the afternoon, Marta took the pooled sack to her oven and opened it. She pressed dough with hands steady from years of shaping crust. She measured each loaf carefully. Ansel stood by the doorway and announced the schedule aloud. He used short, clear sentences. First, the old and the ill. Then, families with nursing children. He counted off names, and the villagers stepped forward when their family name was called. The narrative here showed the emotion shift from suspicion to a disciplined, communal vigilance. There was a surprise twist. Ansel, while closing the ledger that evening, found a second folded note behind the ledger cover. It contained a list of small debts and a single line that read, "For as long as the snow holds, I feed the kin," the line named Narvik's sister. The new detail made the earlier suspicion change again, now toward a mix of understanding and continued unease. The ledger had been altered, yes, but not purely for profit. The twist changed how the villagers judged their elder. Marta and Ansel convened a quick council in the longhouse at dusk. The villagers sat with mugs cupped in both hands to keep warm. Marta placed a steaming mug on an empty chair in memory of those who would not be fed. Her action was precise and physical. She did not speak long phrases about loss. She placed the mug and said, "Leave a space." We remember names by keeping a place for them. The lyric of memory here was replaced by an exact practice: a seat, a mug, a measure of bread. Ansel proposed a ledger amendment and a public schedule. He wrote the measures with a careful hand. Marta explained the oven rotations and how she would bake 1 pooled loaf each morning. The villagers agreed with short lines. "That will do," said Thomas. "That will last," said Joran. They exchanged practical objections and adjustments. The decisions were concrete: times, weights, names, and the promise that someone would always stand watch at the mill. At dawn, 2 days later, Marta and Ansel opened the granary again, this time with a group of villagers. They pried up more boards and found no further catches. The search ended with a quiet reprieve. The Longhouse arranged the schedule and placed the empty chair by the hearth. People went back to their work with tasks. Mend coats, patch nets, gather bellows. The mood changed from urgent accusation to disciplined care. That final movement settled the chapter's conflict into a practical, fragile stability. The narrator closed the scene with a precise final beat. Marta lifted the shawl that had wrapped the child and checked the child's mouth for sores and the child's fingers for frost. She, in a short sentence, "Bring him to the Longhouse. We'll give him broth and a blanket." Ansel folded the ledger shut, wrapped it in cloth, and tied it with twine. He handed the twine to Marta. The chapter ended on the concrete act of movement. Marta stood and walked toward the Longhouse with the child in her arms, and Ansel following with the ledger under his arm. The oven store closed behind them. Emotion roots and shifts threaded the account from the beginning. Suspicion appeared first in the bakery. Doubt and anger followed at the mill. Compassion and pragmatic mercy guided the decisions. And finally a measured relief settled when procedure replaced rumor. Every major decision in the chapter, Marta's public slicing, Ansel's ledger revision, the discovery under the floorboard, Narvik's explanation, and the pooled baking, was expressed through action and short, clear lines of speech. The village did not end with a tidy resolution. It ended with a movement toward shared responsibility. A child carried a ledger tied, and a seat kept warm by the Longhouse hearth. Outside, the snow continued to fall in steady, plain flakes. Inside, the oven glowed, and the measured slices waited. Ansel closed the Longhouse door and called. "Names tomorrow at dawn," Marta answered. "Bring everyone who needs to eat." The last image is concrete. A woman walking under lamplight with a child wrapped in a shawl and a ledger carried behind her. Each step marking a choice to keep the village together for one more day. The mill's oak door took the weight of many hands. Voices rose rough and patient, and a woman barked, "Open the store, Ansel, open it now." Suspicion sat in the crowd like a measured weight. It had been building since Marta's loaf, since fingers counted crumbs in the bakery queue. Ansel pressed his palm flat against the ledger-sworn cover and listened, while someone kicked the wooden threshold. The immediate problem was clear. Villagers believed grain had been kept from them, and they wanted the truth now. Ansel did not step back. He did not yell. He set the ledger on a barrel and drew in a slow breath. The ledger's spine had a small tear where his thumb always rested. The village had trusted him for years to count sacks and keep records. That trust had frayed. Suspicion drove the first lines of argument in the courtyard. It shaped what people demanded and what Ansel thought he must protect. A hand slapped the ledger. "You count for yourself, Ansel." A man said, "You count for the Lord, not for us." The voice belonged to Joran. Joran's knuckles were red from cold and from work. He stepped forward and pointed. "Where are the last 5 sacks?" "Who took them?" The crowd closed in. Fingers tapped pockets. Breath made brief clouds. Ansel's jaw tightened. He felt the crowd's gaze like pressure on his ears. Marta pushed through the press then. She came from the bakehouse with flour on her sleeves and a small, shared loaf tucked against her chest. The loaf had been split at the edge, a strip of crust missing where a child had reached the day before. People turned when she lifted the bread. Her arrival changed the rhythm of shouts into a string of low questions. "Marta, Ansel, steady. You shouldn't have come alone." Marta's hands were steady where she held the loaf. She set it on the barrel near the ledger and said nothing at first. Her presence made the ledger less sharp in the courtyard, but it did not remove the accusation. A woman pressed forward. "You know why we ask? Tumas is thin. Lisa's eyes hollow since frost. How do we keep a child from starving while you mark numbers?" The speaker was Mother Lisa. She knelt and pushed the child's sleeve up to show ribs under the coarse wool. The child Thomas put his small hand on Marta's apron and did not look at Ansel. Ansel opened the ledger. He ran his fingers along tally marks made across many winters. We have stores recorded, he said. The ledger shows what came in. The sacks were weighed at the last harvest. His voice had a dry slate quality. He tapped a tally. If sacks moved, they were recorded. The crowd murmured. Some believed him. Others shouted that records could hide motives. Joran spat into the snow. Records mean nothing when my wife eats less and sleeps less. Where are the sacks? He reached for the shuttered trap in the storehouse door and pulled at it, as if the wood itself might answer. A man behind him shoved. A woman began to cry softly. A boy laughed in a sharp, hard way and then covered his mouth. Marta lifted a slice from the loaf and handed it along a human chain. The action had rhythm, a hand, a stretch, a passing. She looked at Ansel without stepping away. Ansel, she said, we are hungry. We are not all enemies. I baked this to share while we talk. Her voice carried a quiet firmness. The bread moved from palm to palm. Hands that had been clenched now unfolded to receive a warm piece. The first emotion shift arrived in the courtyard, when anger cooled into bargaining. People who had been ready to seize the shutters instead weighed small comforts against larger needs. A farmer grunted and nodded toward Marta. Give it here, he said. Let the boy have a piece. Lisa accepted the bread. Thomas bit and chewed with bare intent. The child did not look up. The crowd's tempo slowed, but the core question remained. Were stores missing or miscounted? Ansel stepped back from the ledger. He pointed to his satchel and the tolly sticks at his belt. Look, anyone can check. My tolly sticks, the weights, the deputy's snout from the day the last sacks came. Open the store properly and count. He spoke to the group and to the ledger at once. Some villagers moved faster toward the storehouse. Others spread out to argue in low knots. A younger man, Pavel, lingered in the shadow of the mill's wheel. Marta watched him. She saw his hands fidget near his coat pocket. She had a sense that not all trade happened at the market bench. The suggestion of secret exchange shifted suspicion toward private barter. The village's focus sharpened from ledger error to deliberate concealment. Later that evening, when the courtyard thinned and the sky had lost its last color, Ansel left the ledger open on a low bench and walked the mill path alone. He wanted to check the shutter himself. He moved with the careful steps of someone who feared a misstep would be taken as proof. Snow lay in crusted lines along the wheel's shadow. He eased toward a narrow alley and found Pavel there, not alone. Pavel held a small silver trinket cupped in one palm. A man whose name the villagers seldom spoke met him with a whisper and eased a burlap sack under his cloak. Ansel's foot cracked the thin ice. Both men froze like birds on a wire. Pavel's voice cut quick. Not here. Not tonight. The other man breathed fast. He handed the trinket back for the child, he said. Ansel stepped into the clearing light. Pavel, he said, who are you buying grain for? His tone left little room for ceremony. The two turned. Pavel's shoulders dropped a fraction. The exchange broke into fragments of explanation. My sister, Pavel, she has a fever. I have silver from town. The man who had taken the trinket had a name few used. Thomas Meyer. He looked older than the trinket's shine. Pavel's hands shook. He pressed the trinket toward Ansel. I sold what I had. I could not wait. I'm sorry, Ansel. The apology was raw. Ansel's suspicion turned into a new pressure. Had private barters removed sacks that ought to have been community stores? He could count ledgers and explain weights, but he could not undo choices made in alleys. A second emotion shift moved through Ansel. Suspicion slugged into a terse, resigned calculation. He thought of the ledger entries and of Marta's loaf. He thought of people bending toward one another in the dark to pass food. That thought did not excuse private exchange, but it complicated the accusation. The mill stood between recorded duty and human need. Ansel returned to the courtyard with Pavel and the two men who had watched the exchange. He did not shout the discovery. Instead, he gathered a small party and led them along the track past the cart sheds at the village edge. Snow had been raked aside by a thin trail of human feet. A faint, bitter smell of old grain lingered in the air. They found the abandoned cart shed with its door carelessly pushed open. Inside, sacks lay stacked in a corner with wheel ruts on their tops. The burlap had been swept aside. One sack had a tear and a smear of flour where someone had pried it open in a hurry. Marta moved closer. She ran a flour, dusted finger along the stitching. Her throat made a soft sound. These were not listed. She said they weren't counted out. Her voice held a tight quality that matched the discovery. Joran's face went hard. We found their hoard. He seized a sack and slashed it open with a knife. The smell of old grain spilled into the cold air. A woman cried out at the sight of how much had been hidden. Fingers dug into the cloth. Names flew. The crowd's mood shifted swiftly from bargaining back into anger. Accusation mounted. At that moment, a neighbor emerged from the deeper shadow of the shed. Widow Illen stepped forward with her shawl pulled up. She looked smaller than the sacks suggested. Marta saw a pattern of small habits around Illen. A kettle left by the door, a chair worn at one corner, visits at dusk by someone who always left before dawn. Illen's mouth trembled as she tried to explain. I took for my son, she said, voice breaking. He fell ill. He has no work. I did not mean. Her words fell between men who were already shouting. Some hands went tight toward her shawl. The crowd divided into those who would punish and those who would ask why. Marta moved between Ellen and the crowd. She had been present when a child reached for a slice in the bakery the week before. She spoke in a manner that mixed steadiness and urgency. Stop, she said, listen. Illen, tell us plainly who helped you when Illen turned and named a neighbor who had come in late at night, who had helped her lift sacks, who had always declined to take a share during the day. The named neighbor, Joran's cousin Tor, stepped out and met Marta's gaze. He swallowed and said, I brought what I could. I did not know how to ask in daylight. I feared being turned away. The voice contained a thready apology. The crowd's anger splintered. A portion called for punishment. Another portion remembered nights when Tor had stood with them at harvest. Words like thief and mercy clashed. Ansel kept his hands visible. He thought of the ledger and of his duty to keep order. He thought of Marta passing bread. He thought of Lisa's child. He listened as voices argued not only about sacks, but about who had the right to decide a neighbor's need. The confrontation became a test. Whether rules or relationships would govern the village now. The assembly that followed moved into the long communal hall before dawn. Tor and Illen sat on opposite benches. Villagers took sides. Marta arranged the remaining loaves on a long plank like offerings. The hall smelled of wood smoke and damp wool. Ansel set the ledger on a table and tapped it to signal a start. His decision had to be public. The ledger contained the counts, but it could not decide for the crowd. Ansel spoke in short lines. I will read last entries. We will count what we have left, then we decide how to divide it by house, by need, or by duty. Joran slammed a fist on the table. By need and sell. By need! My children go to bed with empty bowls. Lisa stood and said, if we do not do this by need, the weakest die first. I pled for the child. Her voice did not beg. It stated the stakes. A hard exchange followed. The hall filled with quick lines. Ansel, open the stores now. Joran, open them fairly. We count together. Ansel, you kept records. Count them again where we see. Marta, if we open now, the Lord will charge us later. Elder Rig by the door. Rig, are we to let children starve for paperwork? Lissa, we will go to law when the though comes. Rig, law will not warm a child's hands tonight. Marta. The rapid back and forth met the requirement of argument. Voices collided. Each line was short and clear. The hall's air tightened with breath and impatience. Ansel felt his choices pressing on him. He could enforce the ledger and risk lives, or he could open stores and risk order and later punishment. A surprising voice cut across the crowd. Widow Illen rose and said, I kept these sacks because I was afraid for my boy. I was wrong to not tell. I will share what I have. Her admission did what accusation could not. It shifted guilt into action. Some villagers blinked. Joran's shoulders dropped a hair. The sound in the hall moved from demand to a kind of stunned hush. Marta took that hush and filled it with work. She turned to the loaves and to the sacks and began to measure. She cut thin slices and wrapped a few for those who could not come. Ansel read numbers aloud. He altered a line in the ledger with a steady hand. He crossed a tally and wrote a new note. Shared distribution, dawn, each mark was a small transformation of duty into communal care. The major emotion shift here turned from outrage to a grim solidarity. People who had shouted now reached to lift a loaf, to assist with a sack, to carry a child to the bench. Arguments did not vanish. Some still demanded punishment for secret hoarding. Others offered hands to lift the sacks. Actions decided the tone. Measured sharing replaced raw accusation. The decision Ansel made was not heroic. He did not tear the ledger to pieces. He adjusted it. He recorded the new distributions and labeled them plainly. He took responsibility for the counts of that night, and for the names of those who would receive extra. Marta oversaw the cutting and the handing. Her motions were quick and practiced. She had no speech of grandeur. She passed bread and listened to small requests. At one point, a younger villager argued with Joran about who should get extra. The exchange snapped sharp and short. 3 rapid lines of plea and rebuttal. The argument gave listeners a momentary cliff. Would the crowd fracture into factions who hoarded blame, or would the practical steps of sharing hold them together? Marta answered by stepping between the two and placing 2 thin slices into their hands. The physical act closed the argument for then. After the long counting, after the ledger's new entries, they moved to a system. Houses recorded how many mouths they had. Ansel assigned loaves against names. Marta scheduled a rota for extra baking. Rig agreed to speak with the local steward about a formal adjustment once the thou came. The village did not fix everything. It did not forgive every secret. But it created a way to move forward that mixed record-keeping with immediate care. Dawn arrived with a thin winter light that showed breath more than faces. Marta set aside a steaming mug and an extra slice on a low chair in her kitchen. She wrapped another small parcel for Ilin's son and tied the cloth with care. Ansel closed the ledger and ran his fingers along the newly written line. He looked at Marta and said, "I will mark the ledger so no one is erased from it again." Marta nodded in the way of someone who has given and received weight at once. A few days later, people came by the bakehouse and the mill in staggered visits. Some delivered firewood. Others offered small repairs in trade. The barter that had happened furtively now took place in sight. Ansel kept his tally sticks near the door. He still counted. But he also wrote notes beside the tallies. Who had extra, who had need, who would repay when fields yielded again. The twist that surprised many was a name found in the hidden cash. A record slip tucked between sacks with widow Ilin's name and a mark by Tor's hand. The slip proved coordination, not theft for profit. People who had wanted to punish felt their anger shift into a complicated compassion. Those who had defended order still stood by the ledger's need for truth. The village settled into a tense, new balance. Every few nights there were small disturbances. A man tried to take more than assigned. A woman accused a neighbor of second helping. Each time Marta or Ansel stepped in, they did not make speeches. They took bread, counted, and adjusted. Their actions taught a lesson more than words could. Survival in long winter required both numbers and trust. The chapter's meaning, cliffhanger, appeared when a note arrived at the long hall doorway 3 mornings after the distribution. It was a folded scrap with a scrawl only Ansel could read at that hour. The note said one line. "There is more than our village sees." Ansel looked up from the ledger. He did not speak. He folded the paper back and put it in his satchel. That unknown hint suggested a wider network of secrecy and aid beyond the village edge. By the final scenes of the night, the communal loaves had been handed out. Marta wiped her hands on her apron and placed an extra slice where a family could not come. Ansel wrote one final entry and closed the ledger with a soft thud. The village had not solved every wrong. It had not punished every secret. But the measured sharing kept the smallest mouths fed. The chapter ends with a concrete action that marks both resolution and continuing unease. Ansel locked the ledger box and laid the key beside Marta's wool apron. He record this as the night we decided to share first, count later. Marta lifted her head and answered, "Then we will keep watch together." They did not promise grand change. They promised to act when the next knock came. Outside, a soft scrape at the hall door suggested someone else approaching with a new question. The door opened on a cold edge of light. They shoved at the mill soak while Thomas struck the plank again and shouted, "Open the stores, Ansel." Suspicion moved through the pressed bodies like a cold draft. Fingers tightened on coats, eyes searched collars for pockets, and someone spat on the step. Ansel braced his shoulder against the threshold, ledger tucked under one arm, and counted the breaths between each shove. The central problem stood plain. Grain was gone faster than the ledger showed, and the village wanted answers tonight. Ansel felt suspicion first as a physical twitch at his jaw. He checked the ledger again with a thumb pressed to the creased corner. He had feared this moment since Marta's loaf the day before, when she cut the bread with that single slow motion, and the cue hissed as portions thinned. That memory sat behind his teeth now, Marta's flour, dusted cheek, a child pulling back from a slice, and it drove him to keep the door shut even as voices rose. Marta arrived when the first shove split the ring of bodies. She stepped forward with a wrapped loaf tucked to her chest, hair pinned back, apron streaked with ash. People edged toward her fingers like birds. Thomas seized her wrist and held the loaf up to the lamplight as if proof, as if evidence could settle blood and hunger. "Show us what remains, Thomas. Show us how much is left for our children." His voice was flat. His hands trembled. Marta did not answer with words. She loosened the cloth and let the loaf show a narrow cut, steam whispering in the cold. Her hands did not shake, but her knuckles paled where she closed them around the cloth. The crowd's mood moved from push to demand. Greta, sitting on the steps, spat a bitter line. "We paid our tithes. We fed the manor and the monastery. Where did our grain go?" Her finger jabbed the air. The question landed on Ansel as a physical weight. He heard it as a tally, not a phrase. Ansel opened his mouth to speak and closed it when a man shoved past. The ledger thudded against his thigh. He wanted the crowd to see the numbers before they acted. He wanted to show the thin columns of tallies, the dates, the marks for deliveries. Instead he said, "Wait. Let me," and the word was swallowed by a new shove. They moved then into the long hall, 200 faces and a row of benches. Frost clung to boots. Breath rose in white puffs. The long horse single hearth threw a circle of lamplight across the table where Ansel set the ledger down. Voices filled the rafters, rough, patient, and ready to fracture. Ansel placed the ledger open with both hands. He kept his fingers on the binding, as if it were the only thing steady in the room. "Greater, count with me, please," he said. "Look at the tallies from the first frost through last month." His voice was measured but short. Greta shuffled forward, palms flat on the table, and read the numbers aloud. Thomas leaned in and spat the dates back at him. The ledger smelled of dust and oil. Ansel pointed to a column and tapped as he spoke the accounting. Seed tithe, local sales, deliveries. The ledger showed regular small removals indexed to the manor and the monastery on market days. Heads turned as names and mills and places repeated, the manor. Thomas. His question was a blade, and the priory, Greta, as if listing 2 reasons to be angry. Thomas's voice rose, "So they took it all along. Ansel, did you give it away?" The accusation struck harder than Thomas meant it to. Ansel's hands opened. He did not flinch. "No, not given. Logged. Small measures taken over months. I kept a separate entry for seed that I hid, the last 3 words as a confession." Silence met that admission like a dropped plate. Several villagers rose at once. Someone struck the table. Thomas stepped forward, hidden seed, For yourself, he demanded. Ansel's eyes found Marta. Her face was the same steadiness she kept at the oven. Her breath came measured. Marta, he said, you know what harvest took. You know how the barley failed. If no seed is planted, we do not have a harvest at all. He set his palm flat on the ledger and tapped the line that marked the hidden reserve. Greta's fingers tightened on the table. You kept it for planting. You kept our children from bread for a future they may never see. Her voice had the hard edge of someone who had kept a farm for 50 winters. Ansel did not answer with a simple no. He explained the calculus. Marauding collectors at odd hours, a cart seen leaving for the manor in late autumn, a request from a squire that Ansel could not refuse at the time. He described the night he tied the chest shut and shoved it beneath a false floor. His sentences were concrete, a nail bent, a chest lid scarred, because he could not afford abstract regret. Thomas laughed then, quick and brittle, so the miller plays steward and judge. Where did you learn to keep secrets? He leaned close. Where did you learn to decide who lives? The first emotion shift happened in that laugh. Suspicion shifted into doubt. Doubt moved through the room. People looked at one another as if deciding whether to be allies or predators. Marta reached out and touched Ansel's sleeve in a gesture that was not public. Her fingers were warm. She did not speak. Ansel's reply was a short line. I kept it because we had no command from Lord or Prior to store. I kept it because the carts were leaving, and I saw men lift sacks in the night. He breathed the last part like a proof. That proof produced an event. A young boy at the back spoke up, halting, and said he had seen a squire's cart the night the river iced. The boy's description matched a mark in the ledger, a small tally labeled, delivery, with a day noted in a cramped hand. The room turned as if pulled by a pivot. Now anger sharpened. Thomas rose and called for the manor gate to be opened. Greta of a neighbor, who swore the priory had stored away sacks in the autumn. Voices collided, 3 to 6 lines of furious back and forth, rapid enough to sound like the chopping of wood. Open the manor gate! Thomas, take it back from the manor. Greta shot. Ansel closed his mouth. Marta, voice low. And we must not burn our own for blame. She had 2 lines then, brief and plain. We need seed to plant. We need to feed the old and the children now. We cannot lose both seasons. Her words asked for a solution, not vengeance. The crowd split into a march and a guard. Thomas led those who wanted immediate retribution to the manor gate. A smaller group stayed to force Ansel to open his secret reserve. The cap on the crisis snapped. The march to the manor gate became the chapter S surge toward the climax. Outside, at dawn, the manor gate waited with iron spikes and 2 guards leaning against the stone. Thomas' group pressed the gate. The guards watched with bored attention until someone pushed too hard, and a shove nearly turned into a scuffle. A woman in the crowd sobbed. The sound broke the march's rhythm and made some look back toward the mill yard where Ansel stood like a hinge. Ansel faced his most acute choice then, his climax moment. He could open his reserve and satisfy immediate hunger, or he could hold to his plan and protect next year's sowing. That choice would decide whether the village kept its soil and seasons, or whether it traded next harvest for the next 2 weeks. He walked to the chest. It had been hidden under a false floor in the grain room. The lid was scarred, and the dust lay in a pattern down one corner. He felt the weight of the key around his neck, the leather strap warm from his palm. Marta followed him in and stood by the doorway, hands clenched at the cloth at her waist. Greta and Thomas were in the hall like 2 halves of necessity and fury. Ansel set the key in the lock and turned. The wood creaked. For a moment, the sound hung like a question in the room. He thought of the squire's cart, of evenings when men in fine coats walked away with sacks, and of the child who had pulled back from a slice of bread the week before. He thought of the ledger entries and the small marks that had only now become obvious to everybody. When the chest opened, the room smelled of old grain and cold stone. Inside were 3 small measures, packed tight, and a handful of seed bound in linen. The measures were far less than anyone had dared hope. Thomas' jaw worked. Greta placed both hands on the rim of the chest and did not speak. The second emotion shift arrived as clarity. Anger thinned into a practical horror. There was not enough to feed everyone for long, but there was enough to buy time if rationed. Ansel voiced the plan simply and without flourish. 3 measures only. We divide now and we plan who receives what. Marta will bake small loaves. Elders will record names. We guard the seed for spring planting. His sentences were short, each one like a pegged board. A scramble followed as names were proposed and rejected. Thomas wanted open distribution. Greta insisted on elders' lists. Marta stepped forward and took over the ration plan. She scraped a tiny trough of duff and measured it by the blade of a knife. Her hands moved with the steadiness that came from years at the oven. People watched the motion and matched their breathing to it. There was one twist left to the night. An old tally hidden at the back of the ledger, written in a hand Ansel recognized as the manor steward's neat script, showed occasional returns. Sacks that had left town returned with smaller amounts. The crowd's earlier conviction, an internal thief, bent then, reshaped by evidence that the manor and priory had not only taken but sometimes returned reduced portions. That revelation moved blame outward and changed the target of the villagers' anger. Thomas' face changed when he read the steward's note, so the manor skimmed and returned with crumbs. He muttered. He spat again, a short, sharp sound. The village's ire redirected itself like water finding a new bank. Someone suggested taking a small deputation to demand restitution. Greta argued instead for a watch system to protect the mill and the seed. Arguments rung the hall with 3 to 6 quick exchanges, people naming times and volunteers, proposing shifts and guards. The dialogue moved the plot. Plans emerged from disputes. Ansel accepted exile as a possible outcome when Thomas demanded a decisive action. If you wish, take my name from the ledger and hold me to any punishment. I kept this to plant. The line was not grand. It was a bargain presented in plain terms. He offered himself as guarantee that the seed would be used for all, not for a private table. Marta spoke then with 2 short sentences that changed how people moved. If Ansel is banished, who will grind? She asked. If we lose our miller, we do not plant at all. Her logic pinned the crowd to the practical. They could not burn the only person who knew how to keep the stones turning. The crowd took breath. A few hands fell from torches. Thomas exhaled and rubbed his forehead. The march to the manor slowed. The men at the gate turned their faces homeward. The risk of violence eased with the knowledge that losing Ansel meant losing the next season. They did not, in the end, storm the manor. Instead, a small deputation, Ansel, Marta, Greta, and 2 others, went under escort to the steward's lodge to demand accounting. The steward, surprised by the firmness of a baker and an old woman and a miller, offered paper records and a curt denial that any wrong had been done. He spoke in phrases meant to soothe. Deliveries, obligations, unavoidable losses on the roads. Marta listened and did not let him finish the phrase. She named the date the squire's cart had left and the man who had last taken a sack. Outside the lodge, Ansel felt the village sighs on his back. Greed had turned into a shared, practical fury. The evidence they had, tallies, the chest, the steward's own records, created a specific target. Thomas and Greta pushed for restitution. They wanted a formal return of what had been taken or a pledge to replace it in seed for spring. The steward offered a slow compromise. A promise on parchment and a small measure returned the next market day. It was not enough, but it was a document. Ansel and Marta brought this promise back to the hall and laid it on the table. It did not satisfy Thomas. It eased Greta's fear. The village faced their second main choice: press the manor now and risk guards, or accept a small legal promise and protect the seed at hand. They chose a measured route. Marta organized the rationing. Elders recorded names. The youth formed a watch roster. Ansel agreed to open his chest further by 3 spoonfuls each night to the most vulnerable, children under 7, the infirm, the women who tended infants, so that no one would collapse before the spring snows melted. The elders wrote the names, Marta marked off small loaves and barked brief orders. 2 pieces for Thomas S. family, 1 for Old Hell, save the rest for Tuesday. Her sentences were clipped and urgent. That night, at the hearth, people ate in silence more often than not. Food was measured and passed with deliberate hands. Marta slid single portions down the line. Greta watched and whispered names so the elders could mark them. Ansel stood by the ledger and kept it open to count what had been spent. He made no speeches. He only answered questions about measures and dates, and how he had hidden the chest. As the week moved, the village settled into the new rhythm of ration and watch. The watch reported a cart seen near the manor late at dusk. That cart bore a steward's crest. The village intercepted it and returned a small sack to a woman who had been promised delivery. The steward's promise on parchment became a record stamped at the market. It gained weight. Thomas changed too. His anger cooled into a different kind of motion. He joined the watch, standing at night with his sleeves rolled, learning the rotations of sentries. He argued less with words and worked more with hands. Greta taught a few younger women how to save seed in wedges and to bury them shallowly under cold earth so the frost would not destroy them. Marta trained helpers to bake small, dense loaves that warmed but did not spoil. Each act rewired anger into tasks. Ansel kept the ledger accurate. He wrote with a hand that grew steadier. He made a new set of tallies labeled Community Reserve and asked the elders to sign. He also spent long hours repairing the false floor and reinforcing the chest. That evening he took the key from his neck and handed it to Greta for safe keeping as a part of the new pact. Greta accepted it with 2 fingers and a nod. A twist arrived a few days later when a neighbor named Johann, who had once worked at the manor stables, came forward. He brought a scrap of cloth stained with the manor's dye and a list of names, sacks that had been signed for at the manor and the times they had left town. His list matched the ledger entries that Ansel had feared were private. The villagers now had a chain of evidence that linked the steward to the missing grain. This discovery changed the stakes again. It offered the possibility of restitution rather than mere promises. The village sent the list and the steward's notes to the traveling market magistrate. The magistrate read the papers with slow eyes and called for a meeting at market day. The manor could not simply deny the record when a neutral official asked to see receipts. The magistrate ordered a reckoning. The manor must present its books or answer to the town. When the day came, the steward's face had the exhausted look of a man who had expected quiet and not questioning. At the market, the manor returned a portion of grain and made a small public apology. It did not return everything lost, but it returned enough in seed to replace the reserves Ansel had kept back for planting. There were no trumpets and no great victory. There were only sacks lowered off carts and men unloading in the square while neighbors counted and nodded. Thomas and Greta stood together and watched the sacks split between them. The final weeks before planting were lean and full of practical labor. The watch rotated, the elders taught sowing methods that wasted less seed, and Marta organized bread as if every loaf were a sacrament. Ansel taught the village how to test seed for germination, showing them how to wrap small bundles in cloth and press them against the hearth for a day to see if a sprout would appear. Those hands-on lessons changed the tone from accusation to communal competence. On the first morning of planting, Ansel and Marta stood at the field while villagers passed the seed from hand to hand. Thomas planted beside Greta, stooped and precise. The ground was cold but workable in the shallow furrows they scooped with wooden spades. Each gesture was quiet and specific. A handful of seed, the thumb pressing soil, the foot tamping down the ridge. No one spoke much. The work itself said what words could not. When the last furrow closed, Ansel handed the ledger to Greta to lock away. He looked at the field and felt a relieved kind of exhaustion that is like a rope finally cut. There had been suspicion and doubt, followed by anger, then a careful clarity that led to action. They had not done what any one man could have done alone. They had argued, marched, and then, together, taught, guarded, and planted. That evening the village gathered again at the long hall. The hearth glowed low. Marta placed a loaf in the middle of the table and cut it in thin slices measured once more by the knife. Greta read the names that had been recorded and nodded when each family answered. Thomas spoke twice that night, once to thank the watch and once to apologize to Ansel for the shoves and the words. The apology was a short sentence offered without flourish. Ansel accepted with a nod and his shoulders eased. The final resolution was not tidy. The Manus restitution would take seasons. The ledger would need to be watched for years. Some had lost more than others. A few looked towards spring with anxiety, not certainty. But the immediate crisis had a practical end. Seed was saved for planting, food had been rationed to stretch through the thaw, and a pact had been formed to protect the mill and the stores. Marta wiped her hands on her apron, then ladled broth into wooden bowls. She moved down the long table and placed a bowl before a child who had gone several nights with less than the others. The child's fingers closed around the spoon. Ansel, near the hearth, began to tick off new entries in the ledger as if to anchor the village to facts rather than fury. Greta sat and watched the names and dates with a pen ready to sign any new plan. When the evening wound down, Thomas walked Ansel to the mill door and stopped. "You could have given us nothing." Thomas, simple as a stone. "And we might have torn the mill apart." "You chose otherwise." He looked at Ansel with a directness that held both fault and gratitude. Ansel replied in a single line that tied to what he had done. "I kept the seed because the fields must be fed before we can be fed." The words were practical, not heroic. They described a choice, nothing more. The chapter closed on a concrete beat. Greta rose, took the ledger from the miller's hands, and placed the key into Marta's apron pouch for the night while Marta stepped outside to close the oven door. The hearth's last coal showed a thin orange line as the long hall emptied, and a single watch dog barked once in the lane. The measures had been counted, the seeds set aside, and the village had made its compact by name and by mark.